Yeah, just wait until, yes.
Yes. Thank you very much. I'd like to express my gratitude on behalf of the Landless People's Movement political party to Rear Admiral Peter or Pietrus Vilo, Member of Parliament, for really coming to this house to try to intimidate political parties, but at least being honest about his mandate to kill and threaten us. I'm very happy that he has said it. And I will quote. First, at point 6, he says, however, if the current debate is anything to go by, his own words, there seems to be a deliberate, ideologically motivated attempt to use the current economic and health crisis to drive a wedge between the nation and its security forces. Very, very political. I probably written for him by some sort of a political person. Very political and himself very deliberate in trying to assess how our response will be on the basis of his threat. And he says ideological. So he says, therefore, there is a systematic approach by those that would talk about figures around the military. And therefore, he invokes a very old theory, what is called military supremacy of the armed forces within a democratic space, which forms part of the essential deep state, meant to either subvert or consolidate the power base of their choice. Very, very bad. Typical African Minister of Defense speaking, paid to harass others. I continue because he likes also to quote a number of Americans. Very interesting that he, by the way, chooses to quote a lot of Americans. Point 8, he says, and it's paragraph 3, he says, a well-ordered modern state is defined by a monopoly. Listen to this, Honorable Chairperson of the Whole House Committee. A well-ordered modern state is defined by a monopoly on the legitimate use of force, which allows domestic markets to operate. You see, this man is dangerous because he forgets that the state is the political equilibrium between political forces and civil society. When that equilibrium is not maintained, the state functions on two bases. First, one of its methods of self-sustaining, the state, not government, is through either coercive force or through consent. This minister never speaks of consent as a way of governance. It's coercive force. Very dangerous in a small country. I proceed. He goes to point 13 and says that there are a number of international dynamics, jihadist, Islamic jihadist threats in Middle East, North Africa, West Africa, and so on. And then he says, without qualifying, Namibia and its people will not be immune from such international security dynamics. He doesn't qualify, Honorable Chairperson, where they have picked up any thoughts around military jihadist activities in this country, how strong that threat is, how they are dealing with that threat. He generalizes it and actually imports a threat justifying the existence of their strategy in a threat that is not identified clearly to an important house that must approve a budget. In other words, if you allow this type of statements to be made, any Minister of Defense can identify anything as a threat from any other part of the world and say, we are also not immune from this threat, therefore give me more money. It's dangerous. He goes on and he says in point 16, you depend on your own resources to defend your national interest. I agree with that. And assert your supreme power and authority. I agree with that. And then he says, and the defense force is the embodiment of that power and authority. The power of the state, not of the government. Correct. Here he recognizes that there are two forms of relationships with state and government. First, a vertical one with hierarchies, and then a horizontal one. But then he goes on, agreeing to a vertical relationship. He goes on and then concedes a horizontal relationship in saying, in addition to being instrument of the state, the defense force is part of the government, which in turn is an element of the state. There is a dangerous horizontal impartation. When he quotes the Americans, and I agree with him, some of the things that the Americans are saying and some of the political philosophy that he stands for, some of it. But when he quotes the Americans, I want to take him back and say that the very Americans recently, the chief of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the US, said to his military forces, you are not here to defend President Trump. In other words, you are saying you are not here to defend a government, but the state. Here our defense force minister is telling us he's essentially here in a horizontal relationship. In other words, in a very close partnership with the government. Very dangerous. And therefore, he says that the defense force, in its horizontal relationship with the state, with the government, is actually a political instrument. That is the concession that he makes without making it. I want to wrap up and move on. Very dangerous, point 18, Honorable Hambuka. Very, very, very dangerous. In fact, this statement we are going to take to our constituents to brief our constituents about the imminent threat that the defense force poses to some segments of society. He says, when one intends, supposedly now parliamentarians, he says, when one intends to destroy a state, the first thing that one wants to do is to render the defense force as powerless and useless as possible. He goes to 19 and say, hence, he connects it. In other words, this statement of 18 is conjunctionally connected to point 19 because he says, hence, it's a connecting word. Wanting to change the government by weakening the defense force has the unintended consequences of destroying the Namibian state. In other words, he says, in order to, he says it without saying it. In other words, those of you that want to change the government through whatever means, first come through the defense force. That's what he says. This is what the statement says. When you interrogate it with serious intellectual capacity deployed to untease the unwritten. He says, therefore, so we should be careful not to throw out the baby with the bath water by politicizing the military. He says, therefore, so we should be careful not to throw out the Swartbooi party government with a bath. Yes. This is what he says. Yes. And the Honorable Yvonne Downsap knows what the principle, and the Honorable Shifeta, my senior man whom I respect so much, knows. The principle of syllogistic reasoning. Courts use it a lot. Deductive reasoning. When you are able to use reason to arrive at a conclusion, what a person says without the person saying it. Because you use tools of interpretation to arrive at a conclusion. Hambiko, what are you looking at? Look at me, please.
I'm looking at you and I'm looking at the time.
I respect you so much.
I'm looking at you and I'm looking at the time.
Yes, yes.
Yes.
So, this statement of the Honorable Minister, Rear Admiral retired Petrus Villo, MP, is a soldier who is basically preparing the cannons, loading the cannons, and saying, Venani, what did you say? Swartbooi, what did you say? This is what this amounts to.
Yes. Let's not write such things.
This is what this amounts to. And I know there are senior people like that, a strategic man, Franz Kapofi, to advise the defense minister on the use of philology in addressing us. Now, how do we support a man who has no voting power, brought in by the president, just like the Honorable Downsap and the Honorable Kalumbi Shangula and the Honorable Finance Minister Pumpu? No voting power, but he pretends to be the most powerful person, threatening elected leaders here.
Yes,
No, hold on. This is a very serious matter.
It's serious, yes. You can
Very
come back.
serious, fundamental to our democracy.
You can come back
because this question begins to say that Vilo does not tolerate nonsense from all political parties other than SWAPO.
Yes, we must rewrite it, please.
I then move, Honorable Hambuka, Honorable Minister of Defense, to an important matter where the freedom and independence struggle of this country is connected from 1960 only. And the ideological, theoretical, and teleological connection to who struggled and who won freedom ultimately for this country starts in the 1960s. And therefore that freedom struggle is also ethnocentric in its posture as it relates to government programs and policies and who government, in other words, state resources must benefit. He says, point 9 in the other one of Veterans Affairs, that the history of the liberation struggle, quote unquote, is to be preserved for future generations. Only liberation struggle. He doesn't say, as a defense minister, that the history of the genocide struggle must also be preserved. Doesn't say that. But he makes reference elsewhere about our forebearers having struggled through a genocidal gaze of the Germans, as the Honorable Margaret Mensah spoke about. But he jumps, typical of SWAPO political philosophy, he jumps and says, only the history of the liberation struggle, in other words, only the struggle of the 60s must be deliberately preserved using state resources. This is what the Honorable Vilo, Member of Parliament, without any voting power, comes to tell us that has voting power. Now, of course, I understand he's a military man. There are certain limitations of military people. There are certain approaches of military people. These two statements, we are going to make a thorough analysis of these further, and we're going to report back to our constituents. I now move to the last part, having been very surprised, as Venani would say, fundamentally surprised by this statement. On a matter in which defense forces are being deployed to achieve different political outcomes in various spaces and places where SWAPO party may not be strong. As we are speaking now, we are aware that there are plans to do some few things in Otavi. There are plans to do some few things in Hobabas, plans to do some few things in Keetmanshoop, to, in other words, predetermine electoral outcomes. That's why military bases sometimes are being constructed. We urge the minister to stick to his word of a non-political army. Then, after the November elections, those officers who are Nama Damara, some who are Herero, in certain geographic areas, suspected of having voted for LPM, have been harassed in the military system. Yes. Even yesterday, I was talking to a person, and if your surname is Swartbooi in the military, you are related to Bernardus. Yes. You must be dealt with. You must, your promotion must be stalled. Now, the other day, I was explaining certain things, and I'm finishing.
Yes.
I'm saying this story to explain an intellectual concept called cognitive dissonance. I was explaining to the Right Honorable Deputy Prime Minister about my experiences, which Honorable Kapofi denies at a broader level, not the specific ones, but he denies at a broader level, of how intelligence and military individuals were assigned to try to harass and humiliate us. And some of us are very sharp shooters by DNA. We have had to defend ourselves. We have had to drive vehicles of ours so fast that we couldn't even recognize which town we have arrived at until we decided, no, a shoot for a shoot, a chase for a chase, a knife for a knife. That is the harassment that we have gone under for 4 years under SWAPO party government. And it's good There was somebody that was a minister that was found guilty by a court of law and then came to me and said, when you are that side, things are fine. When you come that side, there's no independence of judiciary, there is no safety and security, your salaries, your bank accounts get closed and so on. Now, the Honorable Deputy Prime Minister, when I was relating this thing to her, denies it, and Shimi was there. That is called cognitive dissonance. When you are confronted by facts that you know are true, but you don't want to see those facts, all you do is deny. And that surely is what the minister will be doing now. Cognitive dissonance. It's a word, a concept developed by Frantz Fanon. Cognitive dissonance. You deny flatly what you know is true, but what you don't want to come out. Now, Honorable Ambilka, on the basis of the threats herein contained,
Are you not done, eh?
and on the basis that the military does not represent the total interests of the people of Namibia, given this type of leadership, we find ourselves unable to support the budget vote. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The next one is Honorable Kawana.